Morning.
Okay, good morning. We're in Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 2, page 1149. And we're actually right now learning the parallel in the Hemshech Tzadik Dalet 5694, page 84. So we've been moving back and forth here because these two Hemshechim, these two discourses, or these two series of discourses, are really, one is based on the other. Friedrich Rebbe based his whole Hemshech on his father's Hemshech Ayin Beis, what we're learning, with additions and explanations, which is why we're learning both of them together. So where are we? We are now discussing the second approach, what the Friedrich Rebbe calls the second shitta, second opinion or second approach, second interpretation of the two levels of ayin. So remember, we're dealing with a source, Yesh Amiti, the true real existence, which is the creator, Yesh Hanivra, which is the product, the end result, the product, the creation, and the Ayin Be'emtza is the interface that makes it somewhat of a logical process and a bridge between the two, so we can understand how it took place and how to reconnect, as I've been explaining throughout the whole Hemshech. Because Ayin Beis is all the story about the interface. So what is the second interpretation versus the first? The first interpretation was that the two levels of Ayin are both before the Tzimtzum. One is the Etzem Ha'or, the Etzem of Or, which means it's not yet in any manifest, revealed Hamshacha, any form of being drawn. It's just reflecting its source. Basically, the shift there is from Atzmus, built the Metzias Nimtza, to an Or, a field of divine energy called Metzias Nimtza, Or. The second level of Or is called Hispashtus Or. Or that's beginning its functionality. What is functionality? That it now can be it's subject to diminishment, and there is where the Ratzon, the desire for existence, begins, and the different levels of Ratzon we learned: consideration, deliberation, determination, then the Ratzon Prati, where it comes into details, all within the divine consciousness of the Or HaMispashit, Spashtus Or, until the Ratzon HaKodum, Shir Atzmei B'Koyach, where he allocates and prepares the resources, specific resources that by envisioning and defining what resources will be needed, all before the Tzimtzum. Second interpretation, which we're now going to learn about, the Friedrich Rebbe is going to explain it in comparison, is that the first ayin of the Yesh Amiti is Sevav Kalam. The second ayin is Mamala Kalam, Sevav and Mamala, Makif and Pnimi. And he explained that Makif fundamentally really is a pre-Tzimtzum reality. It's a pre-Tzimtzum consciousness. That's why it's transcendent. Even if it comes after the Tzimtzum, Sevav is not impacted by the Tzimtzum in the way that it causes it to become measured, midav v'gvul. What is impacted by the Tzimtzum? That causes Mamala, the second ayin, the ayin of the Yesh HaNivra. That's essentially what we learned in brief. Now, we're going to continue on page 84. And this, as I said, corresponds with 1149 in Ayin Beis. But this piece with additions, which we discussed, additions, Mamala Kalam, and what that is exactly, the Kav, yeah. Just to repeat some of the lines that we learned, I'll just say that before we continue learning. So he says, regarding Mamala, that's generally the Or of the Kav. The Kav is the measured line that shapes all of existence, like the Or Pnimi, like he said, Mamala, just like the Neshama, the faculties all fit into each one, into their container, the same with the Oris and Kem all through the Kav. That's the Mamala. from the Kalim of Akudim, a Kalim of Atzilus, all the way to the Kalim of Biyah, Bria Tzirasiyah. Sevav, on the other hand, he says, even after the Tzimtzum, in general, is talking about the light, the energy before the Tzimtzum, but even after the Tzimtzum, not only is the root of Sevav from the Igul HaGadol, from Eir Ein Sof, before the Tzimtzum, but also, even as it extends after the Tzimtzum, it still remains beyond measure, midah v'gvul. And that's why it fundamentally does not really have distinct levels. Any levels it has is really due to either God wanting to have levels or the kav causing the igulim to have some form of structure, as we learned earlier. Okay. And that's the ayin of the yesh ha-mahave, hamiti rather, and the primi b'chal b'chinas ayin shel ha-yesh ha-misave. And now I'm going to begin continuing here. The line is on page 84. The line begins va'er pnimi. He says, v'zeh hashita hashniya. And this is the second opinion or the second approach, is the word we decided to use. Ba'ayin hamamutza ben yesh amiti ben yesh ha-mesave. This is the second approach to explaining the ayin hamamutza, that the channel, that ayin, that void, that is an interface between the yesh amiti, the true yesh, the true reality, and the created reality. Now, okay, that's the second sheet. What is it again? Sevav v'mamala. V'achiluk. This is all the Frierdiker Rebbe's addition in explaining the Ayin Beis that we've learned. And the difference between the first approach, which was before the Tzimtzum, remember, Etzem Ha'er and Spashas Ha'er, the essence of the light and the extension of it, the function of it. The difference between the first approach and the second approach is this. The Bashita Hadashena, in the first approach, Hineklolos Ha'ayin HaMamutza, the general ayin, mamutza, the ayin that is the interface. Hu ba'er shalifnei tzimtzum. The general ayin is where is it all taking place? Both levels, before the tzimtzum. The nechlak l'shtayim, and it divided into two. Hainu etzem ha'er v'hispashtus ha'er. The essence of what light is, which is essentially all it is to reflect its source. And hispashtus ha'er, which is the air already beginning its functionality, the purpose for which God decided to emanate air. The etzema air, the core energy or light, hua ayin diyesh amiti. That's the ayin that represents, that is reflecting the yesh amiti, the true reality. The hispashtus ha'er, and the extension, or I would say the extension, the expression of the light, hua ayin the yesh ha-mesave, is the ayin of the yesh, of the created yesh. That's the first approach. Ubeshita hashniya, in the second approach that we learn now, the klolos ayin hamamutza hu ba'beis b'chinas sheboy. What does he mean by that? The klolos ayin hamamutza hu ba'beis b'chinas sheboy. By the first approach, he said it was er lifnei tzimtzum, which divided into two. Now he's saying the klolos ayin hamamutza, the general ayin, the interface, consists of its two levels. The language is a bit different. I'm not sure why, but let's read it and then maybe we can understand. What is it? The ayin the yesh amiti, in the second approach. The ayin of the true reality, hu er shalifnei tzimtzum. That's the light pre-tzimtzum. U'kamoshul achrat tzimtzum hu er haseviv. And the way it manifests post-tzimtzum is in the er haseviv, in the transcendent light. Va'ayin shel yesh ha-mesave, and the ayin that relates and of the yesh, of the created yesh, of existence, hu er hakav b'chlal, is in general the kav, the er of the kav, that line that shapes and creates all of existence after the Tzimtzum in general, uba pratius, and more specifically, hu eir hamamala shehu pnimi. It's eir hamamala, which is a pnimi, an internal light. So here, interestingly, he makes a little distinction. Till now, kav and mamala were more or less synonymous. It's still synonymous, but he says the kav is in general, and the mamala is more specific. The reason for that is because the kav, you have to remember, comes from the highest levels. The kav is throughout all of Ishtalshalus. Mamala is actually how the kav manifests in each world according to this world. So mamala is really more specific. You say the mamala, the pnimi of Atzilus, the pnimi of Bria, the pnimi of Chachma, of Bina. The kav is essentially, like I've pointed, the paintbrush with which God uses to draw. It's the measuring stick or the measuring rod that shapes and defines all of existence. And mamala is the actual as it manifests in each place. So they essentially are the same idea, but he now specifies as kav, and beprat is the mamala, which is a pnimi. So mamala comes from the kav, and the kav is mamala, just to explain what the distinction is. But overall, what he said here is really a summary. I don't find anything really a new thing that he's emphasizing. He basically summarizes. The first opinion is everything is before the tzimtzum. The second opinion, the first ayin of the Yesh Amiti is before the tzimtzum, and after the tzimtzum it's seviv. And the second approach is that, and I'm sorry. And the second yayin, the ayin of the created Yesh, is the kav, and more specifically mamala. That's what he added here. I'm wondering the language he used. Ha'ayin mamutza beis b'chinas shabai. I was thinking he was wanting
to means Sevev on Memale, because even the oil shel achar tzimtzum, which is Sev, is the ayin ha'amiti.
So how does that explain why he says b'chol sayin amutzum ma beis b'chinas shabai?
Beis b'chinas shabai from Sevev on Memale. The Sevev le'achar tzimtzum, it is also the ayin.
You don't have to repeat yourself. I know what he says. What does it have to do with the language? Ayin mamutza, who's a beis b'chinas seviv mala. The first ayin mamutza is also ma beis b'chinas shabai. Etzem ha'er is pashtus ha'er.
No, but he said that his pashtus ha'er is the ayin shel hayesh misave. That's what he said before.
And now the ayin of the yesh misave is mamala. So.
The shita l'shoino.
We're talking about two apples and oranges. We know the difference between the two shittas. That's not what I asked. That's very clear. The first shita l'shein is etzamer is passed before the tzimtzum, and the second shita approach is lifnei tzimtzum and seviv after the tzimtzum, and the second ayin hamahat masav is the kav and mamala. That's clear. It's clear like day. That's not the issue here.
That's the base beginner. This is the base beginners. Seven
but the first,
not quite into.
No, but the first mamutz also has two pchinas. Etzamer and Pashtus said. Okay, look, let's not go in circles here. I'm not sure what you're saying.
Yeah, but that's not seven mamala.
It's Etzamer and Pashtus said. I'm not sure what you're saying exactly. Okay.
Maybe when it says Beis B'chinas Sheboy means Shebo oil. Like add the word Shebo oil.
But the first approach is also Sheba Eid. It's Etzamer and Pashtus Sa'ed.
Pashtus oil is quite a tzimtzum, and he said that this is the Yesh HaMisave, the ayin shel Yesh HaMisave. Shita achroino. This pashtus oil is the ayin shel hayesh ha'amiti.
Such a thing doesn't say anywhere in this mimer, in any mimer. I don't know what you're even saying now.
He said it. Look.
But what does that have to do with this? What does it have to do with this too? Okay, what are you trying to say? What are you explaining? Tell me. What are you trying to explain?
That Shita Rishono he is the right, has nothing to do with even Koidem Atzimtzum, the hispashtus is a ayin shel yesh hamisaved.
That's what he says in the mimer. What are you adding that doesn't say in the mimer here? He says that in the
You ask
mimer.
what are the two pchines? What are the two pchines?
Okay,
So
listen, do me a favor. Listen. You're confusing me, and I'm sure everybody else, to be honest. I don't know what you're trying to say. He says that in the mimer. What are you telling me? The difference between the two shittas? We know the difference. What are you adding, if I may ask? The two shittas are very straightforward. Etzemer is Pashtus is the first shitta before the tzimtzum, the two levels of ayin. The second shitta, the second approach, is the two levels of ayin, is lifnei tzimtzum and la'achrat tzimtzum seviv. That's ayin shel yesh ha-miti. And kav and mamal is the ayin shel yesh ha-nivra. 1 second. What are you adding to what I just said?
You are the two pchines. So I said
I just said to you what the two pchines. I don't understand. 1 second. I just told you two levels in the first shitta and the second shitta. What are you adding? Just explain to me. I don't know what you're adding. What do you want to say? What are you trying to add?
I try to answer your question. You said it's not clear what he said. So I said that the base beginners, I think it's said on the mind. It does not make it koinem tzimtzum or le'achar tzimtzum.
Okay, I don't understand. I'm not clear what you're saying. Seva Mamal is what he says in the mimer. What is he? What do you? Okay, it's fine. Let's move on. It's all right. It could be what you just said, Naftali, may be correct, that he's saying that the Ayin Mamutz in the second approach is in the two levels in, no, it's not clear to me. In what? In Eir? We know that it's in Eir. Ayin is Eir. I'm not sure what Shaboy is.
In Hispashtus oil.
Yeah, but it's not two levels in Hispashtus Eir because Mamala and Kav is after the Tzimtzum. If it was two levels in Hispashtus Eir, Lifnei Tzimtzum, yeah, that would make sense. And to say Ayin Mamutza is the base pchinas of Hispashtus Eir Lifnei Tzimtzum and Eir HaSeviv La'achrat Tzimtzum, I don't think he's saying that.
He's saying is also.
As I said, I'm not understanding what you're saying. So you're repeating, but I don't understand really what you're saying at all, to be honest. What is Shaboy? Translate Shaboy in one word. Beis Pchinas Shaboy. What is Shaboy? In what? One word. Can't hear you. By the way, your connection, we can't hear you. Okay. What is Shaboy? If you could tell me what Shaboy is, I'll be able to. What is the Shaboy? Pchinas Shaboy in what?
Could you hear me? Shaboy means Shaboy.
Okay. So you're not adding anything. That's the whole mimer is about two levels in ayin. So, okay. First of all, your sound, you can't hear your sound. So do me a favor. We can't hear you. We cannot hear you. So either get let's continue. Can't hear you. It's very frustrating. Okay, let me continue now. Okay, so we finish here chapter 19 in Tzadik Daled, finished with the second approach. The second approach, as we said clearly, is the ayin of the Yesha Amiti, is the Eir before the Tzimtzum. Most likely, pastors, that would be a pastors say, even though he doesn't say it explicitly. But let's argue and say, they say that. Maybe not, because it could be Seviv is rooted even higher than that, but I'm not sure. but let's not get into that because he doesn't state it. Eir Lifnei Tzimtzum in general, like he said on top of the page. So Eir Lifnei Tzimtzum hu b'chlal Eir HaKol B'Atzmusei. And how does that manifest after the Tzimtzum? It manifests in Seviv. Now, the second level of the ayin from the Yesh HaMisaveh, meaning the created Yesh, is the Kav and Mamala, which emerges only after the Tzimtzum. So now in the second approach, you basically have pre-Tzimtzum and post-Tzimtzum, and the pre-Tzimtzum manifests in Seviv, in the transcendent energy after the Tzimtzum. But now we've introduced Kav and Mamala, so the ayin is on a lower level than it was in the first approach. What I'm going to do now, I'm going back to Ayin Beis, because the next chapter here is now going to a third. He's going to call it a Shita Shlishis, a third approach. The Rebbe Rashab, on the other hand, doesn't call it by the name first, second, or third, even though it is those levels. So I'm going to go back to page 1149 in Ayin Beis, third line from the bottom. And now he's going to talk about this, a third approach, which the Frierdiker Rebbe calls a third approach. Let's learn this, and then we'll go back again to Tzadik Dalet to see what he adds and explains. Okay? Again, if you're confused, we're using two documents here, two different books. One is Ayin Beis, one is Tzadik Dalet. We just finished Tzadik Dalet, page 84, the end of the chapter. I'm moving back now to page 1149, Ayin Beis, volume 2. And all these pages on PDF format on ayinbeis.com if you want to follow along the text. So he says now like this, Omnam, however, after we explained these two different approaches, what the Frierdiker Rebbe called Shita D'Shein and Shita Shniya, right? The first and second, he says, Omnam, says the Rebbe Rashab, HaKavona kana kavona. The intention here, what does he mean by here? By this Hemshech Ayin Beis, what I want to really focus on, what is the intention in this mimer? Is a third approach, what the Frierdiker Rebbe will call a third approach. And what is that? The Klolos Bechinas Ayin HaMamutza, Ben Hayesh, that the general Ayin HaMamutza, one second. I think I can understand where the line is in Tzadik Dalet once I see this. I thought it would become clear. I'll explain in a moment. Let me first read here. That the general Ayin HaMamutza, that interface of Ayin interface between Beis B'chinas HaYesh, between the Yesh HaMiti and Yesh HaNivra, Hu B'chinas HaEr Pnimi. Both levels are in the immanent energy, in the internal energy. So here we have it. The first opinion, the first approach, it was all in the Eir HaSeviv, basically. I wouldn't even call it Eir HaSeviv. In the Eir Lifnei Tzimtzum. The second opinion, or the second approach, it was partially both. It was Lifnei Tzimtzum and Seviv after the Tzimtzum and Mamala. Now he's saying both ayins are in Mamala itself. And I think that's what he meant, Beis B'chinas Sheboy. B'shita Shniya, Klolos Ayin HaMutza. The first Shita, Klolos Ayin Mutza, is all before the Tzimtzum. And the second approach, the general Ayin HaMutza, is in both levels, before and after. Maybe that's what you meant to say. I think that's what he's saying. And the third approach, they're both after. They're both in the Mamala, which of course is after the Tzimtzum. I think that's the language. That now it makes sense to me. So the first one, the general Ayin HaMutza, is Lifnei Tzimtzum, and that breaks into two, Etzem Eretz Pashtus. The second approach, the general Ayin HaMutza, is both levels, meaning Lifnei and La'achrei, and then he explains what that means. And the third approach, both levels of Ayin are in the Er Pnimi, and the Rebbe Rashab says, and that's the Kavona here. That's what we're addressing over here.
Shaboy, according to what you said now.
What I said now, because I see the language. In the first one, he says, Klolos ayin mamutzahu ba'er shelifnei atzimtzum. In the second approach, he says, Klolos ayin mamutzahu ba'beis b'chinas sheboy.
What's that?
So sheboy, I would say, would mean in the Eid Ein Sof, lifnei atzimtzum and la'achrei atzimtzum. That's what I think boy means here. And now, he says, the Loshen Klolos b'chinas ha'mayim mutzah hu b'chinas ha'er pnimi. That's why I'm comparing it. The first one is basically all in Lifnei Atzimtzum. The last one is all in Er Pnimi. And the middle one, the second approach, is that it's in the two levels of Er Lifnei Atzimtzum and Lachre. That's what I think he means. I'm just comparing the three terms that are very similar, and each one he uses a different expression. If you look at the beginning, in all of them he uses Klolos Ayin HaMamutza, who one is Lifnei Atzimtzum, one is Beis B'chinas Sheboy, and one is Be'er Pnimi. So you tell me, how would you interpret that? Okay. Okay, so now, in Havana, it's clear. It's just a matter of the language of what he means with those words. One second.
You are in improvement test?
One second. One second, please.
Page in Ayin Beis.
Okay, close. What did you ask me?
Which in Ayin Beis?
I can't hear your sound is not good. I can't hear you clearly. Anyway,
I don't know. Which page? Which page?
I said already 1149. I said it 6 times.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So now it's all in the Er Pnimi. V'hu nechlak l'shnayim. And in this imminent energy, it divides into two. So now the Rebbe Rashab is going to explain what this means. I'm just checking everything. Yeah, and then the Frierdiker Rebbe will learn how he explains it more. So now we're looking for two levels of ayin in the imminent energy itself. Up till now, we didn't discuss such a thing. Till now, it was clearly one level was removed from existence and one level related to existence. Either lifnei atzimtzum like etzem ha'er and hispashtus ha'er, or in the second approach, lifnei atzimtzum and seviv, which is removed, more or less, and mamala, which is related. So now he wants to talk about two levels of ayin in mamala itself, in pnimi itself. And here's where the Rebbe Rashab is going to explain this. He's going to say the following. I want to just say, when the Rebbe Rashab is saying the l'cheira yesh lemer and kana kavona, apparently he's referring to the mimer that he's using this is based on. Because he's not saying yesh lemer on himself. He's saying when we say that the mamala has two levels, which is Pashtus Maimonim from the Alter Rebbe or probably the Mittler Rebbe, he's saying that the B'cheira b'zeh yesh lemer b'pshitis, seemingly we can say in a very simple interpretation, but pshitis, obvious or simple, what are the two levels? The kav, because the kav, the kav, remember we said was the narrow line, the kav dak v'kotzer, kav v'chud dak v'kotzer, a line, a thread, even though it extended, it was transmitted after the tzimtzum. It's not a pre-tzimtzum reality. It's a post-tzimtzum creation, so to speak. Creation is not the right word. There are different opinions whether the kav is yesh ma'ayin or gilia helam. So take away the word creation. But it definitely emerges after the tzimtzum. Nevertheless, where does it come from? It's not a new light that came from nowhere. It ultimately is Hamshachose, its transmission is from Lifnei Tzimtzum. That's where light is. The kav does not come from the tzimtzum. It comes after the tzimtzum, but the tzimtzum is concealment. So where does the kav get its light from? Let's go back to the example with the teacher. Even if the teacher, the brilliant teacher, completely conceals his brilliance and he's silent, you don't hear a thing from him. And then he begins to teach Ayin Beis, or he begins to teach students on their level. So those two, it's a narrow kav now. You can't compare it to the Eir, to all the Eir of his brilliant seichel, of his intelligence. But where is this kav coming from? Even the Ayin Beis Gimel Dalet, even simple words, are all coming from his seichel. It's just in a very narrow flow. It's not coming from his concealment. It's coming from the Eir that was pre-Tzimtzum. It's been definitely contracted and limited and all that. But what the Rebbe Rashab is saying, the other side of the kav is, at the end of the day, it comes just like the intelligence that comes from a teacher to students. Even if the students are infinitely distant from him, it's still coming from his intelligence, not coming from somewhere else.
You could
So
say
the
that
kav,
about all creation.
what?
You could say that about all creation. I mean, it comes from originally before the symptom from,
No, you can't say, no, you can't. That's why it's called yesh ma'ayin. You don't have, when you say a stone or a human being doesn't exist lifnat tzimtzum. Oyer, kav is oyer. Kav is not a keli. Oyer is always associated with divine consciousness. Remember, lifnat tzimtzum does not mean God. Everything comes from God, from atzmus. But not everything comes from Oyer in a revealed way. Not everything, Oyer creates everything, but not everything has Oyer properties. Remember, we're talking about the properties of Oyer, not just that it comes from a source. Everything comes from a source, of course.
the kav.
The kav is intelligent. The kav, remember, let's go back to the mashal. When the teacher starts teaching the students, he's giving them intelligence. He's not giving them, if he gave them a cup of coffee, no, that does not come from Eir Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, meaning it does not come from his brilliant ideas. That's a whole different entity. That someone had to put there, giving them a cup of coffee. But if he gives them intelligence, he's giving them light, but limited light. And that light is rooted in the intelligence that he had before he contracted and concealed his intelligence. So we're talking about Oyer now. Everything is Oyer, not the fact that everything is created by God.
Got it. Thank you.
By the way, this is also relevant to Lifnei Tzimtzum. When you say, for example, Etzem Oyer reflects Atzmus. Why don't you say everything reflects Atzmus? Everything was created by Atzmus. But the difference is one reflects Atzmus and one was created by Atzmus. The truth is the Yesh HaNivra has the Mitziusim Atzmusei of Atzmus. Remember the idea that it's a self-contained reality, but it does not reflect Elokus. It's basically, simply put, when God creates a yesh, he's creating something that's not similar to him. When he creates when he extends oyer, he's extending something that reflects something similar to him. Now that doesn't mean you can't study the yesh and discover elements of atzmus. But a yesh is not meant to be a mirror image of atzmus. Now
So,
you could ask, what about the fact? What about the fact that a human being was created in the divine image? That's a good question. Is that more like a keli that looks like elokus, or is it more ur? It's a very good question. So, but the point being is, of course, there are things in the shtalshalus, like atzilus, will be in the shape of elokus as it manifests in structure. So the point being is very important to point out here that there are things that reveal. Remember, we talked about things that come from the etzem, but they're not like the etzem. And there are things that come from the etzem, they're also like the etzem. With a big qualification that atzmus is beyond Ur too. So Ur reflects nothing but atzmus. A yesh has its own reality. It's yesh ma'ayin. The efes hamuchlet. It has its own independent identity. Ur doesn't have an independent identity. The kav does not have an independent identity, but its identity is now shaped, as opposed to lifnat tzimtzum. Before the tzimtzum, then there was no shape. So we're talking about shaped light, if you wish. And he's saying, so even though the kav came after the tzimtzum, and that's why it's a kav, but its essential properties are light, and light comes from before the tzimtzum. He's going to explain what that means. That is going to tell you that the kav has an element of the ayin of the yesh amiti. That's what he's leading to. Go ahead. You want to say something?
So kav is essentially a type of ore. And Intel, you just mentioned that today, I think today's Hayom Yom was a chelik al ka, my mom today, in regard to beings.
But a chelik alakam mamal mamish is not the kav. That's a very different type of reality. A chelik alakam mamish is that the neshama has a type of piece of whether we talk atzmos or it's etzema'ir or whatever, wherever you explain it. But bottom line is, this we'll talk about. I don't want to confuse matters now. If you're starting to compare kav and the neshama and Eirei Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, it's going to get very messy. I would continue learning what we're learning, and then we'll discuss how this manifests. Because remember, there's no neshamas and gufim yet. The soul and the body has not yet even become a reality.
Is Rabbi Jacobson, when the Rebbe last line on this page where the Rebbe says that the kav is nimshach hayidei tzimtzum harei hamshach hasav me'or, and so is that as opposed to what you said earlier, that there is a machlokus that whether the kav is yesh ma'ayin? For the people that are hold that is yesh ma'ayin, they would not hold this way, like the Rebbe is saying that he holds according to the shita that it is not yesh ma'ayin the kav?
No, that's not correct. If you look in chapter 6 and on in Ayin Beis, chapter 6, he discusses this at length. He discusses the length. First of all, I wouldn't call the word machlekes. I would say two different approaches. So there are two approaches in how you understand the kav. And ultimately, they're reconciled because there's a primis hakav and chitzenius hakav. But in chapter 6 and on, I believe 6 and on in Ayin Beis, he discusses these two approaches. Everybody holds that the kav is a narrow thread that comes after the tzimtzum. Everybody also holds that the kav originates before the tzimtzum. That's not a question. That nobody disagrees about. The different opinions is what is the primary function of the kav? Is it really an er hagvul, or is it an er habli gvul that the kalim will shape into gvul? That's the discussion. It's not really relevant to here, though in some ways it is, but I would pause before, because you know what my approach in learning. I would right now learn what it says here. And once we finish that, we can go and elaborate and bring into the picture the other material. So, but it's in Ayin Beis, so it's not like it's all part of the one discussion, the nature of the kav. Here, the Rebbe Rashab is relying that we learned that already. That's why I'm referring to you what chapters. I believe chapters 6 and on, I'm almost sure, where he discusses this at length, not in detail. You have at length. It's also, if you want, it's discussed as length as well in the 3-4 Maimorim and Ayin Samach Vov, HaChedesh, Vayelech, and Ki'imcha, and then Adam Ki Yakriv. If you look through those Maimorim, they also talk about it at length and somewhat a different approach, but basically, yeah. I'm looking here. Yeah, chapter 6 and on, especially explicitly, specifically. One second. Yeah. Yeah, it's at length there, at length. So point being is that's only going to make a distinction whether the kav fundamentally is the essence is rooted in lifnei tzimtzum in the er hagvul, or is it rooted in the er habli gvul lifnei tzimtzum? That's the ultimate this difference between the two approaches. And as I said, they're both correct. It depends which level of the kav, primis hakav or chitzenius hakav. But regarding our discussion here, the kav has this paradoxical element. On one hand, it's clearly a product of post-tzimtzum. Pre-tzimtzum, there's no concept of a kav because Eirei Sof Mamala Kol HaMetzias. The whole Arizal, which this is based on, begins with what? Remember, only divine consciousness. Then there's a tzimtzum that conceals it. Then comes a kav that is a narrow flow. So what do you, when you start analyzing it, you have here three different states: pre-tzimtzum, tzimtzum, kav. The kav, on one hand, is now able to, you conceal the bligvul. However you explain the kav's relationship with the bligvul, but it's concealed. The kav can now function as a paintbrush. Think of an artist, and he doesn't have a paintbrush. He's just going to use a bucket of paint. You need to have something that guides and shapes and tailors existence into a structured existence. That's the kav. But on the other hand, the kav is driven by the energy pre-tzimtzum, because it doesn't have light of its own. Where's the light coming from? Like I said, go back to the analogy with the teacher. Even ABC, even Aleph Beis Gimel, coming from the teacher's mouth, is connected and rooted in the seichel of the teacher. Just a very narrow flow, but it's still seichel and it's still his intelligence, and within it lies much more energy than the students can see or experience at this point. So that's the kav. The kav is the channel through which a teacher, or in this case the divine, creates. So it's mitzumtzum. That's clear. It's defined and with parameters. Milo mata. Remember, a kav has hierarchy. So the kav on one hand is defining the structure. At the same time, it's rooted pre-tzimtzum. And there's different ways to explain that. You could say it's rooted in the shir atzmei b'kayach. Remember, the artist, before he began to paint, he actually envisioned in his mind what he's going to paint. So you could say the kav is just the manifestation of what he envisioned. Keep that in mind. So the kav is being informed by and directed by and guided by lifnei tzimtzum, and it actually is Just to explain a little more. Remember, it's not just try to make some logical sense of the kav's role, and you'll see right away that the kav has to be connected to lifnei tzimtzum some way or another. But it came with a hefsek. There was a pause. The kav did not remain. It's not like the Ein Sof lifnei tzimtzum contracted and all was left was a kav. The Arizal makes it very clear that that's not possible. He actually asks, why didn't it happen that way? He says, because it would not be enough. It would be too intense. So there's a pause, but now the kav returns. Chazer v'heir is the expression, but it's returning with light and being informed by the data and information pre-tzimtzum. You want to ask anything?
I don't know if I'm bringing old stuff. Does the kav have anything to do with attaching to the rishim from the source by the rishima?
Yeah, but I intentionally didn't bring it in here because he's not mentioning it here. So why would we go there?
We had it before the Ayin Beis. Yeah, I thought. Yeah.
No, it's correct. The rishima interacts with it, but the rishima is the root of the kelim, the koyach hagvul. The kav is the er hagvul. You're just going to confuse matters unless you have it clear in your mind. What you're saying, what you're asking, it's just going to confuse everybody here now.
I have nothing clear in my mind.
Okay. So he's now said that even though it's nimshach al yidei tzimtzum, which means through the tzimtzum, but its hamshachase is from Ein Sof, from the infinite divine light before the tzimtzum. And it goes further. V'hu nogeya v'davuk be'Ein Sof. And the kav isn't just coming from there and is disconnected, it's actually touching and attached to the Ein Sof lifnei tzimtzum. In the mashal, in the physical mashal, it's not like you have the Ein Sof, then a tzimtzum, and then a light suddenly appears. No, the kav is davuk. The Arizal says it's attached to the Igul Hagadol, to the Ein Sof before the tzimtzum. It touches it and is attached to it, which makes it even more connected to lifnei tzimtzum. The only thing is, it was a pause, conceptual pause between the two. So though, in other words, it didn't remain that the pulled away and just left the kav. No, it completely concealed. And then when the kav returns, it returns attached and connected to its to the Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. Now, obviously, this is not physical, it's conceptual, but think of it this way. I'll use the artist example or the teacher example. The artist is good as well. If the artist begins to paint and he suddenly gets a disconnect, he was disconnected from his envisioning the art, which happens. An author, an artist, a teacher sometimes loses their focus. They lose their train of thought. Why? Because they prepared themselves. They've gone down now to the level of the student. And let's say you lose the train of thought, which means your kav is not fully connected to your mind. Pre-tzimtzum. So it's vital that the kav, to keep it honest, so to speak, a reality check, and to make sure it preserves the integrity of whatever God envisioned pre-tzimtzum in the shir atzmei b'koyach, in the ratzon kodem level, which is envisioning and allocating and preparing the resources. So the kav is attached to that. It's not disconnected. So there's no disconnect, there's no loss. I mean, obviously in God, there's no loss, it doesn't lose its train of thought. But I gave it an example. So the kav actually is attached and connected. It touches and is attached to whatever was there before the tzimtzum. But for it to be functional, it has to be a post-tzimtzum product. That's what he's saying now. Okay. So it's Negei of a Dovuk Ba'erein Sof, page 1150. And he's now quoting the actual Eitz Chaim that I've been mentioning the whole time. The whole thing comes from the Eitz Chaim. Eitz Chaim is, of course, Rab Chaim Vital, writing down the teachings of the Arizal. What does he say? The Acharat Tzimtzum, that after the Tzimtzum, conceptually, post Tzimtzum, him shich kav echad dak ma'oid. Dak ma'oida igel shalei. So after the Tzimtzum, himshich, God extended. Kav echad, one line. Dak, narrow, one narrow, thin line. Dak is thin. Meaning because it's measured, it's very measured. But where is it? But where is it himshich from? Me'eir ha'igel shalei. From the eir of the eagle. What is the eagle? The eagle is the eagle agadol. There's no other eagle yet. It's the circle of light that resulted from the eclipse of Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. It was concealed, remained, so to speak, like a circular light. The kav now, after the tzimtzum, is God extends one narrow, thin line. But where is it coming from? Era Igel Shalei. And then he continues, and he writes, V'kosav, Eitz Chaim explicitly writes, V'kosav Sham, Shu Negeya V'dovuk Be'erein Sof. Negeya, it touches, and V'dovuk, and it's attached to. So think of it, just as an imaginary thought. Imagine the sun gave off light, but between the sun and light, there was some field of darkness. In other words, the light came, but it came with a real leap. But the Arizal qualifies and makes sure to emphasize, no, it didn't come that way. The light of the kav is negeya, touching, and dovuk, and attached to the eagle which precedes it. V'hainu, says the Rebbe Rashab now, Shu'er hadovuk b'mkeireh. That means that this kav is an eir that's attached to its source. Now remember, all this is coming to explain b'pshitus. He used the word b'pshitus, how you explain the two levels of ayin in eir pnimi, in the kav itself. So you see, he's building the case now, how the kav, with all its comparative to and relative to Lifnei Tzimtzum, is a limited light, and is the ayin of the Yesh HaNivra. But when you start dissecting the kav, you see the kav has in it something far, far more than we would initially, not initially, but we start talking about the Ayin Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, you think the kav is nothing. Well, the kav happens to be Dovuk B'mkeireh, V'nizbar Le'il, continuing with Rebbe Rashab, and it was explained earlier. The Inyan Hamshachas HaKav that the inyan, what is the inyan? What is the purpose and function of the extension of this kav? Why is it there? Hu bichdei, it's in order lases milo mato. Now he's going to the other side of the kav. Now we just talked about how it's attached to lifnei tzimtzum. And now he's speaking, on the other hand, its function is in order to create hierarchy, milo mato, to create levels. Now, how does the kav do that? The eliyese, being that this kav, shebiktseo elyon negeiv v'dovuk be'erein sof, being that at the top, the ktsei elyon means the top edge of the kav, it touches and is attached, as we just learned, to erein sof. Ubiktsei hatachten. What about the bottom of the kav? Remember, the kav is attached on top, but a kav is a narrow. The kav is not an eagle. The kav has structure to it. There's my. So he says, the bottom of the kav, the bottom edge, it does not touch the Erein Sof that's beneath it. Let me explain. He doesn't explicitly state it, but in Eitz Chaim he says the following. I wish I could make an image of it, but I think I'll try to picture it. Picture like this. The first image would be, the first slide would be Erein Sof Mamala Kol HaMetzias. There's nothing but divine consciousness. That's Erein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. I'm not getting now into the levels that we spoke about. Just for all practical purposes, it's Poshet B'Tachlis Apshitus. It's shapeless, seamless, divine energy everywhere. You know, like think of the sea covering all of Earth. There's nothing but water. Here, there's nothing but Erein Sof. Okay. Stage one. Stage two, and again, I'm not discussing the levels, how we get to the tzimtzum. We're going straight to the tzimtzum. Stage two, this energy, and this is the image in Eitz Chaim, withdraws. We know today that it's not tzimtzum kipshute, so it doesn't actually withdraw. We'll call it conceals. So it's concealed. But what it leaves is a space, a conceptual space for another reality. As long as the Erein Sof is everywhere, meaning consciously everywhere, like in the example of the teacher, that his brilliance is shining in full glory, there's no room for anybody. No student could sit in his presence. There's no room for anyone. Not that you'll be overwhelmed, you won't even exist. So this teacher contracts. He conceals his brilliance and conceptually leaves space that now a student can enter in his domain, because the student has a space for him. He's left him a seat. Again, not physically, conceptually. That's stage two, that he's left room. What do we have now? We basically have two consciousness. The consciousness, pre-Tzimtzum consciousness, didn't disappear. It just concealed from the student, from the space that he's created. So you have pre-Tzimtzum consciousness, which is now its furthest edge of that pre-Tzimtzum consciousness would be called Igul HaGadol, because that's the space, the light around the space of the other identity, which is the student. And then comes stage three, a connection between these two. Because if it stops there, then you have a duality. You have two different consciousness. The divine, pre-Tzimtzum divine consciousness, you have the post-Tzimtzum space, but there's no relationship between the two. So the kav is now the flow. The teacher begins to speak, begins to transmit energy, transmit ideas to the student. In this case, Elikus is now coming in a very narrow flow. So it's no longer Erein Sof everywhere. This narrow flow is commensurate and able to speak to the student that's in that space, but it's also not a narrow flow that has compromising Lifnei Tzimtzum. It's essentially interfacing. So what is it doing? On one hand, yes, it's a narrow line, and that will go level by level to each level of student and kalim of akudim, atzilus, and so on, biyah. But it always is connected to the seichel of the teacher. So the top of the kav is connected to the light in its full intensity, which means the highest levels that receive from the Kav are going to receive a very powerful flow of divine energy. But the Kav, as it goes down, does not touch the bottom of the space. And the Arizal makes this point. He says it's not like there's a cholol and there's a Kav that cuts through, like, like think of it like a cutting cutting it in half, and the Kav goes down below. And he says, why? Because if the Kav touches the Eir Ein Sof below the cholol, then it defeats the purpose, because the Kav below and the Kav on top are both attached to Eir Ein Sof, and that again would not allow for structure to take place. So the Kav, he says, has to go and stop somewhere. It cannot touch the bottom of the cholol. It cannot reconnect to Eir Ein Sof at the bottom, basically. Now, I know this is all anthropomorphic and bottom and top, but conceptually, it has to have a beginning and gets diminished and a point where it stops. Because if it reconnects to Eir Ein Sof, it will overwhelm the entire cholol. Will, again, not be able to have that space that it needs for structure. So the top of the Kav remains always attached to the Eir Ein Sof Lifnei HaTzimtzum. But as the Kav goes down, the bottom part, he says, Ein Regeya be'Eir Ein Sof, Shemetachtov. In other words, the Eir Ein Sof that's below the cholol, below the Igul HaGadol, remember, is all over, surrounds the entire space. The Kav, however, only goes to a certain point and doesn't touch the Igul HaGadol on the bottom. So essentially, the Kav then has a certain self-contained element of hierarchy and structure. On the other hand, the top of the Kav is always connected to its source. Al-Kain, and therefore, therefore, as the Kav is closer to its source, meaning at the top point, that's called a higher quality, qualitatively a higher state. And as it gets distanced from that source, from the top, the top edge, where it touches Eir Ein Sof, so as it gets more distance, that's what defines something that's lower. So if you ask the question, how does space develop? When there's no space, the godliness is Eir Ein Sof without space. How did space develop? Space is defined by a hierarchy, a higher quality, a lower quality, a higher level, a lower level. So the Kav does that. Because the Kav on the top is different than the Kav lower down, that's why it can create Milo Mata. Whatever's closer to the source is considered a higher spiritual quality level. Whatever's more distance is considered lower. And of course, between them, there's infinite multitude levels.
Rabbi Jacobson, I had learned, and please tell me if it's incorrect, that in the times of the Gula Shlema, the highest levels, the Kav that will reach the other side of the circle, the other side.
Ranat. In the Maimer L'chol Tichler Ranat, he says that. But that comes only after thousands of years of Avodas Hashem, where the Tzimtzum was transformed. Remember, if you remember earlier in Ayin Beis, he asked the big question: Can post-Tzimtzum reality experience a pre-Tzimtzum consciousness? And the answer is only through Avodah, where we transform the Tzimtzum through the years of Avodah with our Nefesh Habamis, which is the Tzimtzum within us. When we work on and we defy this concealment, meaning we transform the concealment into Kedusha and Oyer and so on, then ultimately that's of course the point. That's the goal. But that is only once there's the full Avodah. That would not allow, if that happened at the beginning, you'd never have the structure of existence. This has to come through our work, where I've explained many times, step by step. When we step by step refine ourselves, we are capable of becoming Kalim. Like let's go back to the teacher-student. In the beginning, the student only gets Aleph, Beis, Gimel. If you give the student everything, the student will never be able to contain it. But then the student, after 40 years and growing, is suddenly Koy Ina Shadaita Derabah. How's that possible? So why didn't you give it to him in the beginning? We all understand why, because his Kalim weren't there. First, the student had to first have space, then slowly absorb and assimilate the ideas and grow and work on it, and Yegiya and Aveda Satfila and Birur Hamidus, and slowly sublimating its yeshus, its ego. And then in time, what happens is you've now expanded your kalim to the point that they can receive higher levels of Eir, to the point even of Eir Lifnat Simtsum. And that's when the Kav can go below. But that's only through serious Aveda.
Wow.
Then there's no more Kav after that.
No, that's not correct. There's still a Kav, because then it gets to a point where space and beyond space meet. And space is not eliminated. Remember, Dir B'Tachtenim, full Dir B'Tachtenim cannot annihilate existence. Now you'll say, how do you imagine that? The reason you can't imagine it is because we're not there. But when we become real Kalim and Bittel, Talakus, you can come to a point where you could have both combination of space and beyond space, time and beyond time.
That's that. If Elias is mentioning Renat and it's going to the other side, what's the whole purpose of it? Because
Because then you have, I would think that I would.
What do you mean? I just explained to you. What's the purpose? Why don't you give the student all the brilliance in the beginning? Why does he have to go through 40 years of study?
Yes, after.
One second. Answer that question. Because it's not his.
Right.
You give him a gift. I told you, God can do anything. God can create existence, the worst type of existence, and say it's godliness. Well, that's not a kunst. It's that we participate and we're partners and we internalize it. That's the whole purpose of it all. If without that, all this is meaningless.
Exactly, but after that, it's when
there's no after, because
it goes.
But no. You're speaking in you. There's no after, because it's Ein Sof, and you can always grow in levels of Ein Sof, and the combination of Gvul and Bli Gvul is infinite. It never stops. So there's always going to be movement and growth. There's no retirement village. Just remember that.
Okay. Rav Jacobson, the Igul Gadol, everyone is there discussion if Igul Gadol is before Tzimtzum or after Tzimtzum, or everyone agrees?
Why don't you think about it? How could the Igul Gadol be before? If there's no Tzimtzum, there's no Igul Gadol. So the Tzimtzum, I already explained, there's Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum that is there, and it becomes the Igul Gadol because of the Tzimtzum, because without Tzimtzum, it's Ein Sof everywhere. Igul Gadol means a big circle of light. I told you, like example of the eclipse. When there's an eclipse, the light is still there, but the light is not right now revealed within the circle, within the space, I should say. Igul Gadol is a pre-Tzimtzum Oyer. There's nothing to talk about, because the Tzimtzum has no Oyer. So where's the Igul Gadol have Oyer from? It's Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. But it's in a form of Igul Gadol. If you look in Adam Ki Yaakov Samach Vav, there he discusses, the question is whether Nogabai had Tzimtzum. Did the Tzimtzum impact the Igul Gadol or not? That's a question. But that it's Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, that's not a question. So you have to look in Adam Ki Yaakov Samach Vav. But I would advise you to, if we're learning this right now, I would try to focus. If you start bringing other stuff into this, I can assure you, you're going to be more confused than ever. So right now, I would just keep focused. I know you're bringing in stuff that you've learned elsewhere. It's very nice, but very often what happens then is you are not able to fully concentrate what we're learning here. So I'm happy to explain it because it is ultimately relevant. I'm not saying it's not. It's all part of the big picture. But right now, he's discussing the way creation is the way things were created, the process of creation. And this is the Arizal. So we'll stop here. It's not finished, obviously, but he's going to continue analyzing this Kav. But this definitely goes hand in hand with the chapter, maybe it's even after chapter 6. Somewhere chapter 6 or 7 in Ayin Beis goes at least 10 chapters about the Kav and its relationship with before the Tzimtzum and both sides of it. The Kav is, at the end of the day, every level in Shtalshlus is going to be an interface. And therefore, every level is paradoxical. You're never going to be able to pigeonhole and say something is this and not that. As you see here clearly, we already have 3 interpretations in what the ayin is. So you can imagine, when you're talking to Ruchnius, everything has at least two dimensions, that which is from higher than it and that which is lower, and then it interfaces. So it gets a little complicated, but you know what? We'll get there. Okay, we'll stop here.